Please take your seat. We have to start the next session now. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are kindly invited to take your seat now as we have to start next session. Thank you.
All right.
No,
I think we're starting. So welcome, everybody, and thank you to the MED panel organizers. We have a fantastic panel on the landscape of the social contract in the MENA. So because Roberta Gatti, the chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, is going to have to leave us a little bit early, we're going to just dive right in and get started. And I think one of the objectives of the panel today is to really kind of map out the landscape, both the macroeconomic landscape, the economic landscape, the political landscape, and the social landscape in the MENA, to start to think about how the social contract exists, and if it exists in certain places, and then what it might look like going forward. But I think laying that groundwork is sort of the first step in understanding and getting there. So Roberta, if I can turn to you, can you tell us about the macroeconomic conditions that are sort of shaping the region as you see them right now, and especially some of the implications of the war in Ukraine and the region's kind of macroeconomic prospects?
Thank you, Christine, and let me just say what a pleasure it is for me to be here today. So, as you were saying, Christine, not only there is a strong interconnection between the economy and the social contract, but there's also a strong interconnection between what is happening in our region, in the Middle East and North Africa now, and the global economy. So it's no surprise to everyone that we're moving from a landscape of low interest rates and low inflation to an environment of high interest rates, high inflation. So what does it mean for our region? Well, as you know, we live in a very heterogeneous region. So there's really a two-track growth that is happening. Oil exporting countries are really benefiting from the high oil prices, but oil importing countries are suffering. And let me focus on them for a minute. So Oil importing countries are importers not only of food, staples, but also of oil. And I'm thinking of countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. What is happening in these countries? There are heightened macroeconomic vulnerabilities that I really want to make this clear, have been accentuated by these multiple crises, but they're not new. They actually build on decades of low growth and growth that has not delivered probably what is the most important thing for our region, which is jobs. We are, well, I'm speaking we as if I consider myself with a strong affinity to the region, although I'm not, I was not born in the region, but the Middle East and North Africa region is a region with a very favorable demographic dynamic, but this demographic dynamic is really not leveraged for what is being called as the demographic dividend. And I'm sure that my colleagues here today will speak more to this fact and how it impacts the shape of the social contract. But going back to the macroeconomy, really, the growth in the past 20 years has not delivered either the prosperity that could have delivered, and by some accounts, the regions then would have be 30% richer if it had just grown by the median level of growth of the typical middle-income countries, and also not delivered the jobs. So let's come back to now and what are today the vulnerabilities. On the wake of these decades of disappointing growth, this new crisis and this new macroeconomic environment is really creating significant falls. And I find that the region is kind of bursting at the seams. If you just think about debt, public debt, it is significantly higher than in comparator countries, and the median debt in oil importing countries is above 80%. This means that a lot of the necessary expenditure for services, for health, which I can't see anything more essential right now, but also for social protection, is significantly constrained. Now, trying to tie it back to the social contract and concluding, for me, there are many things that our government should think about, and this is about the what. And one message that instead, or one idea that I wanted to leave you with, is about the how to do it. So there's been a lot of literature and reflection on the interventionist redistributive government in MENA. And this is about what the state does. We've been thinking recently at the World Bank about how the state does it. And the state tends to act in the economy in a way that is very sort of top-driven, with very little measurement and sense of feedback about what is happening. So tying it back to the social contract, one way to rethink the role of the state, make it more responsive to the needs of citizens and also more attuned to the needs of its intervention, would really be to sort of improve measurement, and our region really falls short on the dimension of transparency, and improve accountability, which really means to align incentives in a way so that things can be changed for the better. We wrote a recent report on this that I hope you guys find interesting, but I'll conclude with a saying, which is not original to me by any means, but that spoke to me to sort of summarize this idea, which is, in times of heightened uncertainties, as it is the case here in the macro environment, we should cross the river by feeling the stones. And so that's what I hope that our government decide to do: measure better, take stock of what is happening, and reflect in a very practical way about how they can course correct and rethink and improve the relationship of trust and legitimacy with its citizens.
Thank you so much, Roberta. I really appreciate those insights and kind of that broader view of the macro environment and the idea of a region that, you know, there are divergences and bursting at the seams, right? So some winners and losers in this new environment. Isak Diwan, if I could maybe turn to you next. So Director for Research for Finance and Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics. So as you've observed in certain MENA countries, including places like Morocco and Saudi Arabia, there's a dual bet being made. So this kind of dual model, and it's premised somewhat on the Asian miracle, but it's underpinned by two basic assumptions. So the first is that the public sector can create a private one, and the second is that partial rights will be sufficient in terms of kind of referring to the social contract. So could you tell us a little bit more about this dual bet and how you see that playing out in the region, in the landscape that Roberto has talked about?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question to think more of the political economy, right? The bet in terms of political economy. And I can be a bit less diplomatic than Roberta, I think.
Please.
Talk about that. So for example, what we could contrast is the approach of, on the one hand, Morocco and Saudi Arabia, which is to really focus on the economy and on creating a private sector, on creating growth before doing any political reform, as opposed to, say, the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, where for various political reasons, the focus have been very much on politics in the past 10 years and not at all on the economy. So, and it's interesting to put Egypt and Tunisia in the same bag because, you know, the political bet was extremely different. On the one case, it is very much an autocratic restoration coming after the comeback of the military and how to organize the polity and involve the security. And so the economy had to follow. And so it's an economy dominated by the army with big investment in infrastructure, in new city, not generating much exports, based a lot on stabilization. I mean, you know, there was an IMF program, there's discipline, but also external borrowing, debt rising, the private sector playing a very minimal role, you know, in private investment, 5, 6, 7% of GDP, kind of Nasserist levels. Yeah. So not at all focus on the economy. And similarly in Tunisia, for a completely different reason. I mean, to make this competitive economy work, you have power sharing, unable to make decisions even that Egypt could make on stabilization. So big deficits, borrowing again, private investors getting afraid, private investment falling, the economy getting in bad shape, debt's rising. So most countries are in a very unsustainable situation. That kind of bet to deal with politics first and with the economy later didn't seem to have worked. On the other hand, the other political economy configuration that we have, Morocco and Saudi Arabia, two very different countries, one of the poorest, one of the richest of the region, somehow similar bets. Let's freeze politics for the moment and really invest in the economy. And, you know, hopefully a richer society will be able to improve politically. Does that work? I mean, here, the main investment was very high, is very high in both countries, around perhaps 30% of GDP or so. So a big national effort to invest and grow, and, you know, that demands a very tight governance, top down. Now, whether this would work or not, because as you said, it's dangerous. Can you control the private businesses that you're creating? Can you control society so it doesn't explode? Well, it depends enormously on the quality of the management of this investment. You know, this is the way Asia grew, the Asian miracle, but it's based on excellent management of that effort. How good is the management would determine here what goes, because after all, you have a lot of rent seeking, so that this investment goes to enrich particular people. You may have a tendency when growth is not very good to put pressure on society so it doesn't rebel, and to make friends with businesses that are loyal rather than performant, to kind of block the opposition, crony capitalism. And, you know, indeed, in both countries, even though there is progress, it's not commensurate with the effort. I mean, the growth rates are not commensurate with 30% plus investment. And so I think there's a question mark about whether these strategies will work. But the key is, I think, the quality of the management, which is quite. So two very different political economies.
Yeah, two very, very different styles.
Yeah.
And, Roberta, you've written about kind of the quality of management and the importance of quality of management in the role of the firm. And I know you have to go, but if you maybe you could say one or two things. Do you have a moment? I mean, I think it's a nice segue to think
Happily.
about. Yeah.
So something that Ishaq was talking about, which is how these different, well, not only different priority of politics vis-a-vis economy, but also it's really about the how it is done. So how do you get to good management? One parenthesis, internationally, quality of management accounts by some estimates of for 30% of the differences in total factor productivity across countries. So there's something just there that is very important. What I think Ishaq was saying is that you need to have excellent management if you have a strong sort of directive from above type of intervention. A way to get good management is also to have this type of feedback mechanisms that I was talking about when I was saying cross the river by filling the stones. So that's more a sort of grassroots approach that doesn't bet on exceptional leadership, but it bets on a process that might not be perfect, might not be linear, but as a way to course correct. And this is a bit the risk of strongly centralized, directive from above type of investment. They are bets that are very risky because if they get it right very fast and very well. But if they don't get it right, they don't have that feedback mechanism to course correct. So there's definitely something to it and different modalities to go about it. Eventually, given heightened uncertainty, I think that the risk of choosing from above and hoping that the management is perfect is taking a high risk because uncertainty has increased. So I still would bet eventually for a system where management is based on objective feedback and ways to react to those feedback by changing the course. But I don't know if you agree, Christy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
Ishaq, especially.
I think I do agree. I mean, I think that feedback mechanism is the part in the dual bet. It's the feedback mechanism that might be lacking if you think about top-down political control. And what we know about these types of political systems is oftentimes the feedback mechanism is weak because power is strong.
And if I may, to add one last footnote before I unfortunately have to leave this conversation that promises to be so interesting, at least for someone like myself, is that I'm not even talking about democracy versus autocracy, or I'm not even talking about governments being larger or smaller. There are examples in the world of non-democracies that have adopted this mechanism of sort of getting grassroots innovation and sort of progressive change, adaptive change to investment and economic growth. So I'm making a sort of apolitical type of statement, which I think is possible. And the last thing is that it's also very cheap to do. And in a macroeconomic moment when fiscal stance is super tight, at least for oil importing countries, is the right moment to do it. And for the countries that are now swimming in oil, it's the right moment to do it for them to experiment what could work for their economies. So I'm so sorry that I have to conclude here.
No, thank you so much, Roberta,
you so much for
being with us. We really appreciate it.
And I'll watch the video.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much. Maybe if, I'll take a chance to home in on the case of Morocco for a moment and turn to Dr. Karim Al-Ainoui, who's the president of the Policy Center for the New South. And so Ishaq has said a few things kind of about the Moroccan model, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the macroeconomic and political environment in Morocco. And then I'm particularly interested in, and this has been mentioned, but it hasn't come up in detail, the idea of the needs. So the people who are not in education, not in the employment, not in training, and this youth bulge and sort of absorbing these people into the labor market and what that means for the transformation of the social contract. So could you perhaps say a few things about that?
Thank you. Yes, well, let's a few words about context first. We're in 2022, looking at the region and specific countries like Morocco and others. The past 15 years have been quite challenging in terms of policy making. Let's remember 2007, the financial crisis, and then we had 2011, responding to the demand from population across the regions. They were, of course, again, shocks, commodity prices, oil, food, COVID. It has been challenging. It has been challenging for all society, and this discussion is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a context and in a world. It has been challenging for liberal democracies with very strong polarization of electorate, people not even able to talk to each other. And I think the outcome of that and how countries have reacted has to do with much deeper issues, basically in the reptilian brain of all nations. We are the produce of histories. Moroccans are not Lebanese, are not Americans. It means something. So the nation state means something. It's culture, call it whatever you want. And politics is the produce of that. And if you look at how the region, and I forgot, conflicts, Libya, the aftermath of Iraq 2003, Syria. This is and so how a country like Morocco has sort of lived through that and responded to that. I think one of the lessons is that you need a functioning state that delivers. You can describe it as you want, but let's not get into this, liberal democracy, whatever. But you need a functioning state that delivers, and we've seen this in COVID. You need to deliver health services, vaccines, protect, populations, and there's a demand for that. And I think across the region, the responses of the various states were very diverse. Some couldn't deliver basic health services, and you need at the same time to have a solid macroeconomic policy. Let's remember, a country like Morocco had an excess surplus in its fiscal balance in 2007, and debt was below 50%. Today, it has doubled, basically. Same everywhere. Remember, G20 countries, many of them, even G7 countries are above 100% GDP ratio to debt. So it has doubled because of this response. So now, of course, the space is narrower. And the question, and I think, what to do? What to do given who you are? I think it's important to know who we are, and that's why important that economists should get together with some political scientists, because the response are not in a vacuum again. The Washington consensus, or whatever we think is the consensus today to do, happens somewhere in a country again. And what are your legal structure, how you're organized? Are you an old state? Do you have a practice of government? Do you have reasonable government policy? This is not the case around the region. And so I am very interested in that. How can I craft? You were talking about, experimenting in public policies. It's very difficult for some government to experiment. They want to have the right policy for the whole country in one shot. Should experiment by region, fail, and that's difficult. And data-based, evidence-based public policy making, that was said by the World Bank. But this is, again, not happening in a vacuum. It's about politics. This is not KPIs, work, spreadsheets. No, it has to do with the rapport de force in a country, and we have to be very mindful of that. So I think my sense is that we have an opportunity today, and we've produced, Itzhak has led with some friends, a commission that is a story about the region from the region, which is interesting. It's a report about, what to do now. And I think It has interesting ideas, and particularly this idea that it needs to combine, sound economic policy. It needs to combine what do we do with this debt, particularly from specific countries that have serious issues on debt, and though we unlock the potential, but it has to be very mindful of what are the countries. And I think that there's no such thing as a narrative about the Middle East or North Africa. I don't buy into this, and we can pass the countries from Morocco all the way to Lebanon, etc. So that would be my advice, that we need, and this is the Med conference, so we're part of the Mediterranean, it means something. It needs to have a framework for these policies in the spirit of cooperation that works. I can give one very specific example, and I'll stop here. It's energy, renewable energy. It's something that is of the utmost importance and even has to do with national securities for most countries. There is some stuff we can do together. There are, as of today, very interesting connections through value chains in specific industry. If I talk about Morocco, in the aeronautics and in the automobile sector, you can take, Tunisia has also some nice connections in those industries. So there are very specific stuff we can do together, and I'm not sure that a broad sort of view that is quite generic of let's not fall again in the trap of the 90s. There is a sort of recipe for now. It's look how it is difficult between advanced economies, how it is difficult to reach consensus in Europe, how it is difficult between Europe, US and China. So I want us to be a little bit modest and also deeply understand what are the countries, and that there are no blanket approaches. They can only be very specific, but we can find unlocking points to sort of ignite a positive dynamic. It's easy. It's not as easy as it, in any country for specific region where you have conflict. Of course, it's more difficult, etc.
I really agree with you in thinking about this. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there might be entry points with which we can kind of think about some of these issues. And three of the things that have come out of the conversation so far is, a respect for the history, the tradition, and understanding of kind of the context in which you're operating. The second is, knowing what's the capacity for change. And then the third is this issue around measurement and how do you actually measure change, and not these kind of one-size-fits-all KPIs, but really context-specific methods of measurement. This might be one of the ways to start to think about changing things in the right direction. You said one thing about debt and debt financing, and I'm tempted to go back to Isak, but I'm going to wait because I want to turn a little bit to think about some of the places that we haven't talked about so much, keeping with this trend that there certainly is no one-size-fits-all, because there are places that are suffering and suffering greatly, and I think Lebanon is a case in point, right? So a case really of a failed model. And we haven't really talked at all about how social identity and identity fits into the social contract. We've talked a lot about the macroeconomics and about the politics. So I wanted to turn to Joseph Bahout, who's the director of the Some Fairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and maybe to say a few words about obviously a really different set of circumstances in Lebanon right now. Could you say some things about what's happening there and the evolution of kind of thinking about identity politics in the region in the years to come?
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for the Met Forum. It's a very important gathering here. In fact, actually, I'll probably talk a little bit about Lebanon, but mainly also bounce back on what has been said. I agree with the general line that it's much of a case-by-case situation, but also there are certain basic things. I'm here probably the only non-purely economist on the stage. I'm more of a political scientist. So probably I would also take this opportunity to come back to certain fundamentals, both on the issue of political economy, the social contract, but also on political sociology and political philosophy. For me, as a political scientist, when you say social contract, it's not the literature of the World Bank or the IFIs and etc. It's mainly Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, and etc. It's mainly political philosophy. What is a social contract for us? Social contract is a transactional relation between people and something that they will call after that the state, after having created the state. The state is not something important. And here I agree with you, the state is crafted by people according to situations, context, and etc. But what is this transactional exchange? On the one hand, it's the delivery of goods and services. It's the delivery of material things like social protection, human protection, physical protection, security, performance, roads, electricity, etc., health. But on the other hand, and this is what's maybe a little bit forgotten, and we come back to identity, there's a symbolic good that is being transacted between states and citizens, and between citizens themselves in a social contract. And here it's more issues like recognition, the recognition of people, of their individuality, the recognition of groups also, be them, primordial groups or not. It's the recognition of dignity, of inclusiveness, of the right to participate, to ask questions, to hold people accountable, etc., etc. Now, if you look at the MENA region, and here I think it's not anymore a case by case, it's a one size fits all. One of the main problems of the social contract in the MENA region is that it was mainly focused on the first part, on the part of, okay, I deliver goods, but the other part, the material part, the symbolic part is completely forgotten. This is what created in the literature of the World Bank and IFIs the concept of the authoritarian social pact, meaning I provide you with things, I feed you, I give you roads, I give you high-speed internet, I give you electricity, but you shut up. You don't have a word to say on the political scene, on the public sphere, and this is the contract that works, and it worked mainly in the MENA region because of the permanence and the success, the success of the oil rent and etc., be it direct or indirect. Now, our discussion here is happening, not in a vacuum, as you said. It's happening after 10 years or 11 years of something for me, which is tremendous, which is the Arab Revolution cycle. Now, you like it or not, this is a very important event in Arab and Middle Eastern history. It's something as fundamental as the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Nahda in the Levant, the 20s when the states were crafted, the 50s when regimes were changed, and as Ishaq said, when military came to power. This is as shaking as these events. Now, probably today's assessment is that this has come to an impasse and neo-authoritarianism has won again. The question is this victory of neo-authoritarianism based or predicated on the former type of social contract, meaning the authoritarian social pact, is durable or not? So if the questions of the symbolic aspect of the social pact, dignity, recognition, participation, inclusiveness, all this is not taken into account, is the social contract in the MENA region durable, viable, resilient enough, and etc.? I don't think so, partly because of course, the performance, let's say the KPI, if you want, is not anymore here. States are not anymore able to deliver. Second, because the fundamental of that is today over. We want it or not, in a way or another in the long term, we are in a post-rentier era in the region. So we have to find a new model. We have to find a new basic model, infrastructural model, a material model that will support the social pact, and without the inclusion of this symbolic part of the social contract, which for me is identity, and we come back to your question about identity. The problem of identity in this cycle of Arab revolution was twofold. Part of the revolutions in the Arab world in the last 12, 11 years was based on the quest for identity recognition by the people who were revolting against the state. identity in the sense of who I am, what is my group, what are my rights, and etc. However, and this is the very fascinating and frightening paradox of Arab revolutions, identity was also used by the authoritarian states to quell some of the revolts. Syria is a case in point. The main argument, if you put aside other things, of the regime, of the authoritarian regime that is now prevailing in Syria, is that the identity of a group is at stake, is endangered, and we have to protect it at any cost and with any means. So identity played a very different role. This is why if we don't crack the nut of identity in today's debate in the MENA region and put it inside the social contract debate, I think we would be missing not only a performative issue, but a vital issue that would put societies at stake and probably reopen a cycle of instability in the future. To conclude, I would say that the trap and the danger when we manipulate the issue of identity is that we often think in terms of nation building. In fact, it's not as much a question of nation building, it's a question of state building. What is, I think, one of the impasses of the Arab political thought is that it has, it's been maybe more than 100 years that it's the case. It has been behind and looking for a model of nation building. This is something we imported from the European political thought in the 19th century. However, today the issue is not anymore there. People revolted in Tunis, in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria, today in Lebanon, and etc., not because they are looking for a collective identity. They are looking for a functional state. They are looking, and here I'll conclude with that. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, to come back to political science, a seminal book was published by one of our colleagues, Teda Skocpol in Harvard. It was called Bringing the State Back In. We forgot that there's something called a state, and the state is enough, if it's performed well and managed well, to produce both the material part of the social contract and the social transaction and the symbolic one. So to ensure the production of goods and services, protection, and etc., and to ensure the dignity, inclusion, participation, and what we could call democracy one day in the MENA region. Stop at that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joseph. I think it's a couple of really interesting things that came out of what you said. One is that there is a tendency now, kind of on after the Arab uprisings, to remove the politics from the equation and to remove, especially the identity politics from the equation. But I think, as tempting as that may be in some ways, I think it's dangerous because I think these things always tend to reemerge. And I think one of the things that particularly that you hit on is this issue of dignity and the concept of the state. Right, as kind of regenerating and rebuilding the state, thinking less about nation building, more about state building. And I think it's an interesting opportunity actually to turn to Stefan Hertog, who's Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the LSE, because you've written about these insiders and outsiders in the state. And one of the things we haven't talked about so far is kind of the balance within states and how that balance both contributes to the capacity that the state has and shapes the social contract as well. So in particular, you've written about this, the pathologies of these segmented market economies. And you've called this a particular variety of capitalism. And so I was wondering if you could kind of tell us about this variety of capitalism as you see it, and then how that shapes the relationship between business, state, society, labor, kind of bringing us full circle in this discussion about the social contract.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I think what I'll say, I'll pick up some of the themes that have been brought up already. I think one cross-cutting thing that's come through in all the remarks is that the states are under-resourced across the region. So there are fiscal crises. They have historically promised a lot in their traditional social contract in terms of providing public goods, infrastructure, education, healthcare, jobs, very large public sector employment. And what's been happening is that those kind of formal commitments are still there, but the resources aren't there anymore. And then almost by default, what they've had emerging is a system of insiders and outsiders. So some insiders who still have access to the benefits, who still have state employment, or in the case of private sector firms who still have access to state protection, state subsidies, state contracts. And then an ever-growing segment of outsiders, both on the labor market and among firms who don't have that kind of access to a state that's really overstretched and overtaxed and can't live up to its promises anymore. And I think this fundamental distinction between insiders and outsiders is to some extent a feature of economies all around the world, but it's particularly deep and particularly rigid in the Arab world. And I think the different interests of insiders and outsiders. So on the one hand, people who are employed in the public sector very securely, not on great salaries, but with much better benefits than in the private sector, much higher job security, much better pensions arrangements. They have very different material interests from, say, younger generations who don't have access to that kind of state employment anymore, who often operate on the informal economy, so don't have social security, don't have job security, don't have pensions arrangements. Similarly, in the private sector, you have well-connected, protected firms, often politically connected to the regime. A small minority that's doing very well, often has enormous rent-seeking opportunities and abnormally high profits because of their connected insider position. And then a large army of outsider firms who, again, often operate in the informal economy on the margin with very little security and very little opportunity. And I think this deep division between insiders who are still sort of connected to the fraying old social contract and outsiders makes for very, very divergent interests in society, both in the private sector and sort of the working class at large. And I think this is partially what explains why we've seen so little economic reforms that everyone could agree on, because insiders tend to defend their insider interests. Outsiders often want to become insiders. People who are informally employed on the labor market or unemployed, they don't demonstrate or ask for a better social security system or unemployment assistance. They ask for government jobs. Right? So that's sort of the token around which labor market politics is organized. And then when the government gives in and gives some of them government jobs because the squeaky wheel gets greased, the only thing that does is to slightly shift the boundary, to add a few more insiders to the insider constituency, but without changing the systems. You still have a deeply segmented system with people with very diverse interests, and a system that's also very highly unfair and highly unequal. And I think there's always this debate, is there too much state, is there too little state? Are the economies, have they been liberalized too much or too little? And I think it's really the wrong question to ask, because we have too much state presence in some sectors, in some areas, and we have almost no state in other areas. So it's the uneven presence of the state and the very uneven protection that some people benefit from and others don't benefit from. That's the issue. And to move towards something like a new social contract that's more inclusive, I think some of the insider benefits have to actually be diluted. They have to be eroded to some extent, but on the other hand, there has to be much more inclusive welfare and support for outsiders, a more modern welfare system in the case of the labor market, unemployment insurance, active labor market policy, potentially wage subsidies, cash grants, all those things that other regions have experimented with that the Arab world is so far behind. But right now, I think we have those cartels of insiders, both in the private sector and the labor market, that make it very hard to come to that kind of new social contract.
Yeah, and sort of, diluting insider influence is never easy. Yeah. So it's easy, and also kind of rolling out these benefits, the extent to which these things are very sticky, right? So you roll out these benefits, and you create a set of expectations, and
exactly,
and then and these norms are basically really difficult to change. So we've got limited time left, but just in kind of the last 5 minutes that we have left, I wanted to open it up to everybody else on the panel to kind of reflections and thoughts on what you've heard, and anything else you might like to add. Isak, maybe we can turn to you.
I think we made a lot of progress, but we're missing two elements.
What's missing? Tell us what's missing.
The two elements we're missing, one is the historical one that explains the specificities of the region, and it's not genetic. And the second is where we are today and what are the challenges for the future. So very quickly on both, if I may. So on the first point, I mean, let's remember, we had these post-colonial states modernizing with lots of energy, lots of progress in the 50s and the 70s, the 80s, an inward-looking model, like everywhere else in the world, import substitution and the like everywhere else, collapsed in the 80s. Reforms, Washington Consensus and the like, debt reduction, it took 20 years. And there was a reform of the market. Markets were liberalized, but the polity was not liberalized. Big difference with Latin America. And so here we had aging autocrats with losing powers, myopic, trying to survive, created a very biased capitalism that Stefan just described. one that they could control, that one that was a kind of capitalism that was rather inefficient, where you wanted to be very close to the state or very far from the state, nothing in the middle that is dynamic and the like. That takes us with some growth, nevertheless, to the Arab Spring, because there were no reforms. People have aspirations for something better. And then a chaotic 10 years after, where governments, to survive, spend the whole lot, but do not reform. And so we get to today, three extra shocks, Ukraine, interest rates rising, we're losing market access, there are pressures on the exchange rate, on the interest rate, and the like. Debts are very high, especially in the oil importing countries. And actually, Lebanon explodes. Egypt and Tunisia are close to exploding. The IMF is trying to stabilize a little bit, but not with a big heart. I mean, they're kind of kicking the can down the road, small loans. The governments are not really willing or able to really restructure the economy the way they should a priori. And so we have this report that you were talking about that says, we have a whole bunch of countries about to financially explode. They're not the only one. I mean, there's a debt tsunami, debt crisis tsunami coming, especially if interest rates keep rising across the developing world. One solution is austerity. We think austerity could lead to a social explosion. It's not the right solution. The right solution is to do what hasn't been done for decades, which is grow out of the crisis. These societies are way below potential. Now it's written on the wall. For regimes to survive, they have to put in growth measures. A bit of austerity, but with growth measures, so people know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. They put effort in order to get in a better situation. The second big conclusion of the report is that there are lots of growth opportunities around now. Maybe unlike the past, because the region was never very good at exporting goods. It couldn't compete with East Asia. But now the name of growth is green growth, it's digitalization, taking advantage of that. The private sector has grown, it exists now. It didn't exist in the 80s. Let it flourish. It could take growth on these big opportunities forward. But the last message is that this is not to be left to technical advisor to government. This is the job of politicians. And so this is back to, Kristen, to your title, to your theme here. There is a need for a new social contract, a social contract that allows this growth to happen, that creates a coalition of would-be winners and a way to pay off, if you like, the would-be losers. There are, many monopolies, cronies, polluting industries that won't survive, and they will resist all of that. And they have the means to lobby to resist, and they had resisted in the past. Politicians didn't create the kind of coalitions of the youth, of the educated, of those in regions that can benefit from this more inclusive growth that digitalization in particular could bring. And that coalitions need to be brought. Politicians' main job now is to actually put politically viable growth contracts together, what you call a social contract. And otherwise, and historically we're in a very particular situation, at least in these 5-6 countries, where the alternative is actually repression, austerity, poverty, and truly a poverty and chaotic trap, a little bit a la Lebanon, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think the austerity road is a bad road to go down. I mean, I think that's a road for a social explosion. As tempting as it may be, kind of macroeconomically, to tighten the belt, you've got to grow out of this crisis. So I couldn't agree more. Let me ask our other panelists, maybe we've got about 3 minutes left, so maybe 1 minute each, and then we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah,
please.
let me, a couple of ideas. First, you need, a functioning state is a state that allows you also to manage tension and transitions in society at the lowest cost possible, which is democracy, and some countries, I think, have, and that's fundamental. The second point, let me give you a couple of good news. I mean, we were talking, and tell you a little bit what we do in Morocco. as a virtue of example, not a lesson. First of all, after this crisis, we are trying to generalize the social protection system. And it is being forced. And because we have a specific governance, we are able to force reforms and across on top of these different groups and that you call inside. And that is something that will reshape the fiscal policy. And that I think, and it is also a demand from populations. It includes, a national registry system where we will target with conditional cash transfers and a much more efficient and transparent system of sort of social spending, not the kind of social spending that were described. And I think it is important. The third point I would like to make is about the youth. I have another hat, which is dean at a cluster that has social sciences, economics, and behavioral social sciences. So I see the younger generation. I sit in interviews for them to enter our university, and we see every single student. And I can tell you that I want to reassure you, there is a fantastic upcoming generation. Yes. I see them. They're not virtual. We see them every day at the university. Professors see them, and this is 70% girl. We don't have time to, and this is in the whole higher education system in Morocco. You have 70%, 74, 75% of girls versus boys. We don't have time to explain why. There are a couple of explanations, but if you tend to be depressed, I would recommend that you take a course at a university in the region. I suppose it's the same everywhere. So we need to make them space. It is very important that we create space and safe spaces where they can express themselves. And I see university as safe spaces also to contribute to the future of this region and on all those various countries. And they're having the kind of discussion we are having here. So it is important that we don't stay at a sort of higher view, helicopter view of things. And on insider and outsider, I'm sorry to say, but they are everywhere. Pork barrel has not been invented, in the region. It's the same everywhere. See the courageous, and I think they're interesting reforms that were taken by the Biden administration on canceling the debt, billions and billions of debt. How would you qualify that? I mean, this is how societies work. They're glued together. We need to find mechanism. And again, they have to be efficient. They have to be transparent. They shouldn't be confiscated by a specific group. It is tough to do. It is difficult. And I'm hoping in the region where the IMF is having discussion with government, this is on the table, because this is, this is not about the billions you're going to transfer. It's what you're going to do with it, how you're going to spend it, etc. What are the counterpart, So I think it has to be detailed.
Yeah, and I think it's your point that the region's not unique. The insider-outsider dynamics are present everywhere. I think it is well taken, and also clearing a path for the youth is absolutely critical and maybe a bright spot. So we're up against the end of time. Maybe two quick end comments from Joseph and
Yeah,
Stefan?
because Christian, you asked me about Lebanon, and it's not that I evaded it, but I tried to answer in a broader manner. On Lebanon, very quickly, 2 points related to our debate, because Lebanon is a multifaceted crisis. On the nature of the social contract first, social contract in Lebanon is mainly an elitist communal social contract. Okay, we have to keep this in mind. This is what was done in the 20s, in 43 to 40s, rejuvenated by the Taif Agreement at the end of the war. The problem is that this has built a very strong political system, but a very weak state. And we're back to our discussion. And the condition of having a very strong societal elitist communal pact is the fact that we have a very weak state. So this is why it's a sort of conundrum. And we will not have a strong state in Lebanon able to deliver a social contract like the one we are discussing here if this kind of system is as strong as resilient. Meaning that today, we have not only, and compared to other cases, not only we have the case of a state that is collapsing, but what's worrying, and for us every day, I mean, who live in Lebanon and work on public policy, is the full collapse of the public administration also, which is not only the state, it's below the state. The end of the basic civil service. I mean, unable to deliver a paper, unable to put you a stamp on something that you are making, unable to provide more than 2 hours of electricity. This is as basic as it is. So this is where also the state needs to be rebuilt and to be recontracted again. Second issue, very, very quickly on the question that Ishaq has mentioned, and the question of redistributing a little bit the wealth and diluting, how you said it? I mean, to diluted monopoly. The fact that also today, with one of the most tremendous economic and financial crises in the world's economic history recently in Lebanon, unfortunately, probably the solution will be a solution by making the price be paid by the entire collectivity at the benefit of the same, let's say, political elitist communal class that is repacting again against the basic, let's say, needs of the citizen. And this is where I would conclude on that very, let's say, cynically, at least very, I say it with pain, this is a lost opportunity. The crisis in Lebanon could have been an opportunity to reboot the system, to rebuild another system. Unfortunately, 3 years after the collapse, I think that everybody could agree that, in fact, we're probably going to get out of this crisis with once again the same system, reproduced, rejuvenated, and back again to bite and to hurt people with probably lethal consequences in a decade or so.
Thank you, Joseph. So we have to wrap, but Stefan, final
Two
words?
super quick points. One is I agree that inside-outsider structure exists everywhere, but they're particularly deep and particularly rigid for historical reasons in the Middle East. So I think overcoming those and being creative about prying off some of the insiders into a broader reform coalition, through creative welfare policies, for example, is really the need of the hour. And if people are interested in that, I have a book coming out about inside and outsider systems in the Arab world. So that's going to be out with Cambridge University Press in January. So I'll end on this.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you to all the panelists for being here. Wonderful discussion. I think we advanced. May not have advanced the social contract, but we certainly advanced the debate. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated because the next session starts right away. Thank you.